All right, the president earlier this week, before all the snow hit Washington, was in New Hampshire and talking up what he wanted to do to deal with the opioid crisis and to deal with other things there. It was his first visit to the Granite State since narrowly losing it in the campaign to Hillary Clinton. Of course, his victory there really propelled the way for eventually his Republican nomination when he beat the best and the brightest of the Republican Party to get to the White House. You know, so New Hampshire could be a test, and we're already hearing in this very heated political environment that there's going to be someone trying to challenge the president of the Republican Party. Jeff Flake has alluded to it, maybe that he could be one of them. John Kasich, of course, has hinted that he might be up to that task. The last guy who actually pulled it off and garnered close to 40% of the vote at the time was Pat Buchanan. I remember him on the cover of Time magazine, I think, with a pitchfork. I was just a baby at the time, but I do remember that. Back in 1992. Pat Buchanan joins us right now, the best-selling author, former presidential candidate, on the phone. Patrick, is the president going to be looking at a Pat Buchanan type to challenge him?
I think the president will probably be looking at a challenge, but Jeff Flake and even Kasich, I don't think they come at the president, if they would, from the right stance, Neil. I think the Republican Party is now a populist party in the sense of Trump with the border security issue and tariffs and tough on trade and nationalism, and a conservative party. And Jeff Flake, for example, I don't think is running for Senate in Arizona because he can't get reelected in his home state. So I don't see a grave threat to the president there, but I would be astonished if Donald Trump, President Trump, who would probably be at 40%, at maybe 45% at best, does not sort of invite a challenge in New Hampshire.
Yeah, but to your point, Pat, rarely is any kind of the left or the right outflanked on the middle. Some of the big challenges have come from those who represent a populist wave of the party or more rebellious or rowdy or upset part of the party. Ted Kennedy taking on Jimmy Carter, for example, or you taking on, President Bush Sr., or Ronald Reagan, Gerald Ford. I could go back and done.
If you go back to all those races, what did they have in common?
Right.
The president who won them lost the election.
Bingo.
In the fall.
You read the next wave of my remark here, that whoever wins, and usually the incumbent president survives, he loses. So is that if this president were to face a challenge, is it guaranteed that he's got at best an uphill fight for re-election?
I think it would be damaging for his re-election, no question about it, because there would be certain numbers of hated Republicans. People forget when Nixon ran for re-election in 1972, he got 49 states, a massive landslide. But he had Pete McCloskey against him in New Hampshire and John Ashbrook from the left and the right, and they got 30% of the vote. And going back to when I was a kid, like you were in '92, Neil, and back in 1952, Harry Truman got beat in New Hampshire by Kefauver, and it was only after that he dropped out.
That's right.
And then Gene McCarthy really wounded Lyndon Johnson. I was up there with Nixon in '68, and Gene McCarthy got 42% of the vote against a write-in candidate. LBJ foolishly didn't put his name on the ballot. But 4 days after that, about this time 50 years ago, Bobby Kennedy then jumped into the race.
Remember that? I do. And the famous
Lyndon
line of
Johnson
I will not seek, nor
March.
will I accept my party's nomination. That surprised a lot of people. Now, the president has already indicated, hook or crook, he is running for re-election. Would something like that, again, all of this is just, conjecture, but would something like that give him LBJ-like pause? No.
See, I think, as I wrote in a column about the Mueller thing, and even in the Watergate comparisons, Donald Trump is not somebody who's going to go quietly. Donald Trump is a natural fighter, and he doesn't give up, and he fights rough, and he's a street fighter. And I don't think he would be like LBJ, who would stand down. Or even I remember Mitt Romney when we were running against him in '68. I was with Nixon. And he dropped out of the race. Doesn't seem to me to be.
You're talking about George Romney, Romney, the dad, right?
Well, I don't think that's the character of President Trump at all. Okay. I think he will fight.
All right. The irony of all of this discussion is that the economy is picking up steam. Support for the tax cuts is picking up steam among independents, even some Democrats. Many people are surprised to be seeing this phenomenon, that the gap has widened out for control of Congress with more Americans by double digits, if we're to believe that, favoring Democrats in control than Republicans. What do you make of that weirdity?
Well, I think the one of the problems is now, I believe this: Trump's got a solid base that will stick with him through thick and thin, but there's an anti-Trump base also that is very, very strong and even, I think, somewhat larger. And that's responsible for what happened in the wipeout, sort of semi-wipeout in Virginia and the loss in Pennsylvania. And I think the Republicans are going to have a very tough time this fall holding on to the House. I don't think it's a sure thing they're going to lose it. But if I had to bet right now, if the election were held now, I would think they might very well lose the House. And so you get a lot of things that happen after that. And, you know, it's very hard to predict these things, but I think Trump could be in a real challenging situation by January.
All right, but, you know, Barack Obama suffered some miserable midterms and went on to get reelected the first one and survived the second one. And I guess...
You know, Barack Obama won 2 elections by huge popular landslides as well as electoral landslides.
You're right.
And Trump won by lost by 3 million votes to Hillary Clinton, though he won the Electoral College. I think one of the problems the Democrats are going to have is they're going to have a field of about 20. It's going to be like the Kentucky Derby when they put 20 horses.
No, I liken it to Italy. I mean, it's going to make Italy look like it's stable.
Yeah. And I don't see any of them as setting a track record.
All right, yeah, you could be right on that one. The best thing the Republicans have going for them is a lot more Democrats interested in that White House spot. Thank you, Pat. Always good seeing you.
Thank you.